In the summer of 1991, Viktor Frankl climbed a mountain. He was 86 years old. He had been climbing mountains since his youth, had been a serious alpinist for most of his adult life, and had continued to climb well past the age when most people have retired the ropes and crampons. His wife Eleanor climbed with him. The mountain was in Austria, in the Alps he had loved all his life. He reached the summit. He stood there for a while, looking at what he could see from the top, and then he began the descent. He did this not because he had anything to prove, and not as a metaphor, though the metaphor was not lost on anyone who knew his work. He did it because he loved it. Because the mountains had been a constant of his life for more than 70 years, a place where he could be entirely present, physically present, existentially present, in a way that the consulting room and the lecture hall and the writing desk, much as he loved all of these too, did not quite replicate. This detail, the 86-year-old Viktor Frankl climbing an Austrian peak, is in some ways the most complete answer to the question of what his last years were like and what they demonstrated about his philosophy. They demonstrated that he had meant it. All of it. The philosophy of engagement, of presence, of saying yes to life in all its specific and demanding particularity. He had meant it, and he had lived it, and he was still living it when he was so old that most of his contemporaries had been dead for years. He was not maintaining a pose of equanimity. He was not performing philosophical acceptance for the benefit of his admirers. He was genuinely, in the autumn of an extraordinary life, still interested, still engaged, still orienting himself toward what the world was offering him, including what it was asking of him, and responding with the full force of who he was. Frankl had survived the death of his first wife, Tilly, in Bergen-Belsen. He had survived the death of his parents. He had survived the destruction of the world he had grown up in, the Vienna of the 1920s and 1930s, the intellectual and cultural milieu that had formed him, dissolved by war and genocide into something that could never be fully reconstructed. He had survived the loss of his manuscript at the gates of Auschwitz. He had survived the camps themselves, their Eisenstadt, Auschwitz, Kaufering, Turkheim, the nearly 3 years of systematic degradation that killed the majority of those who entered them. He had, in the immediate post-war years, rebuilt his life in a Vienna that was physically damaged, psychologically traumatized, and uncomfortable with the returning survivors who brought with them the living evidence of what the city and the country had done. He had married again, in 1947, to Eleanor Katharina Schwint, Ellie, as he called her, a woman who became not merely his companion but the partner in the deepest sense of everything he built in the post-war decades. They had a daughter, Gabriele. He rebuilt his clinical practice, became head of the Vienna Polyclinic Hospital's neurology department, wrote the books that would eventually reach more than 40 languages and millions of readers around the world, founded the Austrian Medical Society for Psychotherapy, established the Institute for Logotherapy, and eventually became one of the most traveled and most requested public intellectuals of the second half of the 20th century, lecturing at universities on 5 continents, receiving honorary doctorates from more than 29 institutions, being awarded the Oscar Pfister Prize by the American Psychiatric Association, appearing on television and radio in dozens of countries. All of this is biographical fact. But what concerns us here is what Frankl himself made of it, how he understood his own life and legacy as he moved into his 80s and 90s, how he faced the approach of the end, and whether the philosophy he had built in the crucible of the camps continued to serve him as a personal resource in the very different but equally challenging circumstances of old age and mortality. Frankl returned to Auschwitz several times after the war, not many times, but several. These returns were not gestures of closure or ritual reconciliation. He did not believe in those. They were acts of witness, a refusal to let the distance of decades turn the camps into an abstraction. In his later years, he spoke more often and more freely about the specific details of his experience in the camps than he had in the immediate post-war period. Some of this was the natural loosening that comes with age and distance. Some of it was a deliberate choice. He felt that as the survivors aged and died, the testimony of direct experience was becoming more precious and more irreplaceable, and he felt the responsibility to give it fully while he still could. What he said about the camps in his late interviews and writings was consistent with what he had always said, but often more personal, less organized by the categories of logotherapy, more directly emotional. He spoke about Tilly with a grief that had never fully resolved, though it had become something he could carry without being crushed by it. He spoke about his father's death in their Eisenstadt. His father had been ill for some time, and Frankl had obtained morphine from the camp pharmacy to ensure that his dying was not more terrible than necessary. He spoke about the moment he arrived at Auschwitz and grasped where he was and what it meant. He spoke about the specific faces of people he had known in the camps who had died, their names, their characters, the small details that preserve them as individuals in his memory rather than as statistics. He was asked, in several late-life interviews, whether he had ever been tempted by despair, not in the camps, where the mechanisms of psychological survival had dominated, but afterward, in the long aftermath, in the years of rebuilding and remembering. He answered honestly that yes, there had been periods of darkness. The immediate post-war years had been among the hardest. He had returned to Vienna alone, without his family, without his manuscript, to a city that was damaged and dazed and not particularly welcoming to its surviving Jews. He had written Man's Search for Meaning in 9 days in a state of almost feverish intensity, initially intending to publish it anonymously. He had not expected it to become what it became. In those first years, he had simply been trying, through the act of writing, to make sense of what had happened, to himself, to his people, to the human beings he had watched both rise and collapse in the extreme conditions of the camps. But despair, he said, had never been his primary emotional register, even in the hardest periods. And when pressed on why someone who had lost what he had lost, who had seen what he had seen, had not found the darkness permanently overwhelming, his answer was consistent across many interviews and many years, because he had always had something to do. Some task, some responsibility, some specific obligation that was his and no one else's. In the camps, it had been the project of the manuscript, the determination to reconstruct and complete the work that had been taken from him. After the war, it had been the reconstruction itself, the books to write, the institute to build, the students to train, the patients to treat, the lectures to give, the testimony to preserve. The purpose was not abstract. It was always specific, always concrete, always pressing. And as long as there was something specific and concrete pressing on him, he did not have time or inclination to surrender to despair. This is, in a sense, the most personal testimonial to the central claim of logotherapy. That meaning, specific, concrete, present meaning, is the most powerful psychological resource a human being possesses. Frankl did not merely theorize this. He demonstrated it, across 9 decades of a life that had every reason to be destroyed by meaninglessness, and that was instead among the most productive and purposeful lives of the 20th century. In his 80s, Frankl turned his attention increasingly to the question of his own legacy, not in any vain or self-promotional sense, but as a genuine existential concern. He had spent his life arguing that meaning is not something one creates but something one discovers, that the demands of the specific situation reveal what is asked of the specific person. And as he aged, as his body slowed and his public activity diminished, the specific demand that his situation was making on him shifted. It became less about creating new knowledge and more about transmitting what had been discovered, less about adding to the logotherapy literature and more about ensuring that what logotherapy had found would survive him and continue to do its work. He worried, as old age advanced, about whether the ideas he cared most about would survive the inevitable distortions that accompany the institutionalization of any intellectual movement. He had watched other therapeutic schools become calcified into orthodoxy, their founders' insights converted into techniques that could be taught but not inhabited. He did not want this for logotherapy. He wanted it to remain what it had always been for him, not a method, not a technique set, but a way of engaging with the fundamental questions of human existence, questions that every person must answer for themselves, that cannot be answered by any theory or any therapist, but that can be approached with greater honesty and greater courage with the help of the frameworks he had spent his life developing. Frankl also spoke, in his last years, about his own death with a directness and equanimity that those around him found striking. He was not, he said, afraid of death. He had been close to it too many times to be frightened by its proximity. What he was interested in was the question he had asked about everything else. What is the meaning of this? He had written extensively about the meaning of death as a concept, about how awareness of finitude is what individualizes and authenticates each moment of choice, about how the approach of death focuses the question of what one's life has been for in a way that comfortable distance from it cannot. Now he was engaging with these ideas not as theory but as immediate personal experience. In one of his last recorded reflections, given in an interview when he was in his late 80s, Frankl was asked what he hoped people would take from his work and his life. He said something that was both philosophically precise and personally revealing, that he hoped people would take the courage to ask, honestly and without evasion, what their own specific lives were for. Not what life in general means. That question, he said, is unanswerable in the abstract and unnecessary in practice. Not what the philosophers say meaning consists in. That can be useful as preparation, but it is not the answer itself. But what their own specific life, with its specific relationships and specific capacities and specific history and specific situation, is asking of them. What it needs them to do, to give, to be, to create, to bear. And then, having heard that answer, however incomplete, however uncertain, however demanding, to have the courage to respond to it. Frankl died on September 2, 1997, in Vienna, the city where he had been born, where he had received his education, where he had built his career and lost his world and rebuilt it again. He was 92 years old. Eleanor was with him. He had continued working until very close to the end, a final lecture, a final article, a final conversation with a student or colleague that extended the dialogue he had been conducting for 60 years. He had, as he had always wanted, something to do. Something specific, something his. Something that needed him and that he could still give. His barn, to use the metaphor he had loved, was very full. He had harvested an extraordinary life, not only the books and the lectures and the institute and the honorary doctorates and the international recognition, but the patients helped, the students trained, the ideas transmitted, the testimony preserved, the witness given to what human beings are capable of both in their worst conditions and in their best. All of that was real. All of it had happened. None of it could be taken back. It was sealed, permanently, in the past that Viktor Frankl had spent his life teaching people to understand not as loss but as foundation, the accumulated, indestructible evidence of a life that had been genuinely lived, genuinely given, genuinely in response to what existence had asked of it. The man who survived Auschwitz had, in the end, outlived not only the camps and the ideology that built them but most of his generation, most of his contemporaries, and much of the century that had tried so hard to determine what human beings are ultimately capable of. His answer, given across 92 years of living and writing and treating and testifying, had been consistent from beginning to end: more than you think. Always more than you think.